I'm 52 years old, and I'm just now able to talk about this without that weight crushing my chest. For 40 years, I carried a guilt that was never mine to carry. 40 years of hearing that I destroyed the family, that I was responsible for everything that fell apart. My mother, my grandparents, my uncles, they all repeated the same story like it was scripture. That story shaped who I became, made me question my own worth from childhood, and haunted every decision I made as an adult. I grew up in a house where silence was louder than any scream. My father left when I was 7 years old. He walked out and never came back, and somehow, in my young mind, that became my fault. My mother told me I was too restless, too demanding, that I exhausted my father, that if I had been a better child, quieter, more obedient, maybe he would have stayed. I believed her completely. Why wouldn't a child believe his own mother? My paternal grandfather was a stern man with rigid principles. He never looked me in the eyes after my father left. It was like I carried my father's shame on my shoulders, like I was a living reminder of his failure. My grandmother would shake her head whenever I entered a room, that disappointed look permanent on her face. I learned early that my existence was an inconvenience, a stain on the family name. School became my escape. I threw myself into books, into being the perfect student, thinking that if I excelled academically, if I achieved enough, maybe they would finally see me differently. Maybe they would forgive me for something I never did. My mother praised my grades publicly, but in private, she would remind me that it didn't matter how smart I was. I would always be the reason our family broke apart. She said it casually, like commenting on the weather. That's what made it so devastating. By the time I was a teenager, I had internalized it all. I genuinely believed I was toxic, that my very presence caused pain to the people around me. I started withdrawing, spending more time alone, convincing myself that isolating was an act of kindness. If I wasn't there, if I wasn't visible, maybe my family could heal. Maybe my mother could finally be happy without the constant reminder of my father's abandonment staring at her across the dinner table. My mother remarried when I was 16. His name was Richard, and he seemed decent enough at first. He never treated me badly, but he also never defended me when my mother would make those cutting comments in front of him. He would just sit there, and his silence felt like agreement. My mother became different with him, softer, lighter, like she had finally shed the weight that was supposedly me. That hurt in a way I couldn't articulate. The accusations intensified as I got older. Every family conflict, every disappointment, every struggle, it all traced back to me somehow. When my Uncle Marcus got divorced, my mother blamed my negative energy for cursing the family. When my cousin failed her college entrance exams, it was because I had brought bad luck to our bloodline. It sounds absurd now, but I lived with the constant message that I was somehow cosmically responsible for everyone's failures. I sought validation everywhere else because I couldn't find it at home. I worked harder than anyone I knew. I became the person people called when they needed something done, the reliable one, the one who showed up. But underneath all that productivity was a boy still trying to prove he wasn't the monster his family had convinced him he was. I was performing my own redemption for a crime I never committed. By my 30s, I had built a successful career, gotten married, had 2 beautiful children. But I was still that boy inside, still waiting for my mother to look at me and say she was wrong, that she was sorry, that I wasn't responsible for my father's choices. That moment never came. Instead, she transferred her disappointment to my own kids, making subtle jabs about how they had inherited my destructive nature. I started limiting her time with them, and for the first time, I stood up to her. She called me ungrateful. She said I was the one destroying the family now. That's when things shifted. I stopped calling as often. I stopped trying to earn her approval. I wasn't healing yet. I was just tired. tired of the performance, tired of carrying her narrative about who I was. My therapist helped me understand that I had spent my entire life in reaction to accusations that were rooted in an adult's pain, not in any truth about me. My father's leaving had devastated my mother, and instead of processing that grief, she had given it a target. That target was me. I cut contact for a few years. It was painful, but it was necessary. I needed to exist without that voice in my head telling me I was fundamentally broken. I needed to rebuild my identity based on my own actions, not on the mythology my family had created about who I was. Slowly, I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the villain in this story. Then, 3 years ago, my mother had a stroke. She survived it, but she was fragile, vulnerable in a way I'd never seen before. My sister reached out, asking if I would help, if I could find it in myself to be there. I almost said no. I almost protected myself by walking away. But I went anyway, and I found my mother in a hospital bed. And for the first time in my life, she looked at me like she was seeing me, really seeing me, and not some phantom version of my father. During those weeks at the hospital, something shifted between us. My mother couldn't speak clearly because of the stroke, but she would hold my hand tightly. The nurses commented on how devoted I was, how I sat with her for hours, how I managed her care with such tenderness. My mother would watch me with an expression I couldn't quite read. It was different from anything I'd seen before. There was no judgment in it. There was just looking. My sister mentioned during one of those long hospital days that she had found some old boxes in our mother's closet while cleaning. She asked if I wanted to go through them. I almost declined, but something pulled me toward it. We sat in the hospital cafeteria, and my sister opened one of the boxes. It was full of photographs, old ones from the 80s and 90s, images of our family when my father was still around. Pictures of him and my mother at a wedding, smiling in that way people do when everything still feels possible. Then my sister pulled out a photograph I had never seen before. It was dated 1985, just months before my father left. It was a picture of me as a child, maybe 6 or 7 years old, sitting at a birthday party. I was wearing a paper crown, and there was cake on my nose. I was smiling, genuinely happy. My father was there in the photo, looking at me with such warmth, such pride. But what struck me most was something else in the frame, my mother. She was in the background, and her expression was cold, not just distant, but icy. She was staring at my father and me with an intensity that made my stomach tighten. My sister looked at me carefully and asked if I remembered that party. I didn't, not really. She said she did. She said she remembered that day clearly because she had watched everything unfold. She said our father had spent the entire party with me, giving me all his attention, playing games with me, laughing with me. She said our mother had become increasingly angry throughout the day. She said by the time the party ended, our parents had a massive fight in the kitchen. She said our mother accused our father of loving me more than her, of choosing me over her, of making her feel invisible. My sister said she had never understood it as a child, but she understood it now. She said she thought maybe, just maybe, our mother's narrative about me destroying the family had less to do with my behavior and more to do with something that happened between our parents that had nothing to do with me at all. Our father's leaving, she suggested quietly, might have been about his marriage to our mother, not about anything I had done or hadn't done. I stared at that photograph for what felt like hours. In that image, I was just a boy, loved and celebrated. I wasn't yet the villain of our family story. I wasn't yet carrying guilt for an adult's pain. In that moment, looking at that 6-year-old face, something inside me broke open and healed at the same time. I realized that the narrative I'd been told wasn't history. It was a revision. It was a story rewritten by someone who was suffering and needed someone to blame. When I went back to my mother's hospital room that evening, I brought the photograph with me. I sat it on the table next to her bed where she could see it. She looked at it for a long time, her eyes filled with tears, but she still couldn't speak clearly. I took her hand and I said something I never thought I would be able to say. I said, "Mom, I forgive you for all of it, for blaming me, for making me carry your pain. I forgive you." The sound she made wasn't quite words, but it was acknowledgement. It was the closest thing to an apology I had ever gotten from her, and strangely, it was enough. It wasn't the dramatic confrontation I had imagined 1,000 times in therapy. It wasn't her admitting she was wrong and me vindicated. It was something simpler and more profound. It was two people who had been locked in a painful story, finally choosing to step outside of it. That photograph, the one they hid, the one that showed the truth of that day, it became the key that unlocked something in me. It proved that I hadn't been the problem. The problem existed before me, between my parents, rooted in their own struggles and insecurities. I was just the child caught in the middle and then blamed for being there. Over the following months, as my mother recovered, we never had an explicit conversation about it. She regained some of her speech, but we didn't sit down and rehash everything. Maybe that would have been healing too. But what we got instead was different. We got a reset. We got a chance to interact without the weight of that old narrative. She started asking about my children with genuine interest. She started treating me like a person rather than a mistake she had to manage. I'm not saying we became close in some storybook way. We didn't. We were still complicated, still marked by decades of hurt, but we became honest in a way we never had been before. And for me, the most important shift was internal. I stopped being that boy, waiting for someone to absolve him of a crime he never committed. I stopped performing redemption. I started living as someone who was always worthy, from the very beginning. That photograph sits in a frame on my desk now. I look at it sometimes, and I see that child looking back at me, and I tell him what I needed to hear my entire life. It wasn't your fault. It was never your fault. You were loved. You were wanted. And you deserved to just be a kid at a birthday party, wearing a paper crown with cake on your nose, without carrying the weight of your parents' marriage on your small shoulders. The truth was there all along, hiding in a photograph that was tucked away in a closet. Sometimes healing doesn't come from the confrontation we've imagined 1,000 times. Sometimes it comes from a single image that reveals what was always true, that we were innocent all along. Years passed after that moment in the hospital. My mother recovered enough to live independently, though she was never quite the same. The stroke had softened something in her, made her more fragile and somehow more human. I visited her regularly, not out of obligation anymore, but because I wanted to. That distinction mattered more than I can explain. There was no performance in those visits, no desperate attempt to prove my worth. I was simply her son, and she was simply my mother, and that was enough. But the deeper work was happening inside me, understanding intellectually that I wasn't responsible for my father's departure was one thing. Believing it, feeling it in my bones, integrating it into my sense of self, that took time, that took real work. I started journaling about those early years, writing out the things I remembered, the things my sister had told me, the things I was reconstructing from fragments of memory and family mythology. The act of writing it down, of seeing it in my own handwriting, made it real in a different way. I also made a decision that changed everything. I reached out to my father. I hadn't spoken to him in 15 years. The last time we talked, I was in my 30s, and I had confronted him about abandoning us. He had been defensive, had given explanations that felt hollow. We had argued, and then we had stopped speaking. I had carried that anger for so long that it had become part of my identity. I was the abandoned son. I was the man my father had left behind. That story was so comfortable in its pain that I almost didn't want to let it go. But that photograph changed something. If my mother's version of events had been so distorted, so filtered through her own pain and need for control, what about my father's version? What about my own version? What if I was carrying 3 different narratives about the same events, and none of them were complete? What if the truth was messier, more complicated, and ultimately less about me than I had always assumed? I wrote him a letter. I didn't send it immediately. I sat with it for weeks, rewriting it, editing it, trying to find the right words. Finally, I just sent it. In that letter, I didn't accuse or demand. I simply said that I was trying to understand what had happened, not to punish him or myself anymore, but to understand. I told him about the photograph, about what my sister had told me, about my journey toward healing. I told him I wanted to hear his side, not to use it against him, but because I was tired of carrying incomplete stories. He called me a week later. We talked for 3 hours. It was awkward at first, full of long silences and false starts. But gradually, something shifted. He told me that he had loved me, that leaving had been one of the most painful decisions of his life, but that his marriage to my mother had been suffocating. He told me that my mother had been jealous of our relationship, that she had seen my father's affection for me as a threat to her marriage. He told me that he had ultimately felt caught between his love for me and his recognition that staying would destroy everyone. He told me something else too. He said that over the years, he had heard about the narrative my mother had created, that she had blamed me for the divorce. He said it had tormented him, that he had wanted to reach out and tell me the truth, but he hadn't known how. He said he was sorry, not just for leaving, but for not fighting harder to maintain a relationship with me, for letting shame and his own pain keep him away. I cried during that conversation, not the kind of crying that comes from anger or pain, but the kind that comes from finally laying down a burden you've carried so long you forgot you were carrying it. Here was my father, telling me that the story I had lived with my entire life was fundamentally untrue, that I wasn't the reason for the divorce, that I wasn't toxic or cursed or responsible for his leaving, that he had loved me then and he loved me now. We started rebuilding a relationship. It was tentative at first, careful, like we were both testing whether the ice would hold. We had coffee, we talked about his new family, my children, my career. We didn't rehash the past endlessly. There was no grand reconciliation scene where everything was forgiven and forgotten. Instead, there was just the slow, ordinary accumulation of new memories, new conversations, new moments that weren't filtered through the old pain. My father came to my son's graduation. He brought his wife. My mother wasn't there because she didn't feel well that day, but I could see my father watching my son receive his diploma with such pride, such joy. And I realized something profound. My father wasn't a monster. My mother wasn't a villain. They were just 2 people who had been trapped in a painful marriage, and instead of working through it together, they had let it tear them apart and had each constructed their own version of what went wrong. And I, their child, had become the repository for all that unprocessed pain. During that same period, I did something else that was crucial. I sat down and wrote out everything I could remember about my childhood. Not the narrative I had been told, but what I actually remembered. I remembered my father teaching me to ride a bike. I remembered my mother braiding my hair. I remembered Christmas mornings and birthday cakes and being tucked into bed. I remembered being loved by both of them in different ways before everything fell apart. I also remembered the fighting, the tension, the way the house would go silent when my father came home. I remembered my mother's tight smiles and my father's exhaust. I remembered not understanding what was happening, just knowing that something was wrong. And what I realized was that I had been a child in an adult situation, trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense. And when no sense could be made of it, I had accepted the blame rather than accept the chaos. I shared these writings with a therapist I had started seeing again, a different one this time, one who specialized in childhood trauma and family systems. She helped me understand something crucial. She said that children have a psychological need to feel that the world makes sense, that there's logic and order to what happens. When something devastating occurs, like a parent leaving, a child will often blame themselves because self-blame creates a sense of control. If it was my fault, then maybe I could have prevented it. Maybe I could prevent it from happening again. Blame was actually a twisted form of hope, but that hope had become a prison. For 40 years, I had lived as if I had done something wrong, as if I was inherently flawed in a way that caused people to leave, caused families to break apart, caused pain to radiate outward from my very existence. It took that photograph to prove that the logic I had created was false. The world that broke apart when I was 7 years old didn't break because of me. It broke because two adults couldn't make their marriage work. That realization should have felt liberating, and it did, but it also felt terrifying, because if I wasn't responsible, if I didn't cause the pain, then what did that mean about all the choices I had made based on that false belief? How many relationships had I sabotaged because I was convinced I would hurt them? How many opportunities had I passed up because I believed I was fundamentally cursed? How much of my life had been lived as a performance of redemption for a crime I never committed? The answer was, most of it. So I had to rebuild, not just my relationships with my parents, but my relationship with myself. I had to learn to take responsibility for the things that were actually my responsibility, while releasing the things that never were. That's harder than it sounds. It's one thing to understand intellectually that you're not responsible for your parents' divorce. It's another thing entirely to feel it, to live it, to stop bracing yourself for abandonment every time someone gets close to you. I started making different choices. I stayed in relationships longer instead of sabotaging them before they could hurt me. I took on projects at work that challenged me instead of playing it safe to avoid failure. I spent time with my children in a way that wasn't driven by guilt or the need to prove I was a good parent. I was just present, I was just there, and that was enough. My relationship with my mother continued to evolve. She lived for another 8 years after her stroke. We never had a big confrontation where she admitted she was wrong and apologized for the damage she had done. That wasn't who she was. She wasn't capable of that kind of vulnerability or accountability. But she also stopped the subtle jabs, the cutting comments, the passive suggestions that I was fundamentally flawed. It was as if that photograph and the conversations that followed had shifted something in her understanding as well. Near the end of her life, my mother gave me something. She called me to her house and handed me a box. Inside were photographs, letters, and documents related to her marriage to my father. There was a journal entry dated the day before he left. In it, she had written about her own pain, her own feelings of inadequacy, her own fear that my father loved me more than he loved her. She had written about feeling replaced, about her desperate need to make sense of something she couldn't control. And then, in shaky handwriting at the bottom of the page, she had written something that looked like it was added much later. It said, "I was wrong to blame him. I was wrong to blame my son. I was in pain, and I couldn't see past it." I don't know when she wrote that note. It could have been years ago. It could have been after her stroke, after we had started rebuilding our relationship. It didn't matter. What mattered was that somewhere inside her, in some quiet moment of honesty, she had recognized the truth, and she had tried, in her own limited way, to acknowledge it. I held that journal in my hands, and I felt the weight of it. The weight of her pain, her confusion, her humanity, and I felt the weight of my own pain, my confusion, my journey toward understanding. And I realized something that changed everything about how I see that whole period of my life. My mother wasn't a villain, and I wasn't a victim. We were both people trapped in circumstances beyond our control, and we had each done the best we could with the tools we had. She had hurt me, absolutely. But she had also been hurt. That didn't erase the harm, but it did contextualize it. After my mother passed, I organized all the photographs. I created albums and scanned documents and preserved the family history, not as a narrative of blame and pain, but as a record of real people navigating real struggles. I included that photograph of me at the birthday party, the one that had been hidden for so long. But I also included photographs of my mother before my father left, when she was smiling genuinely, when she was still full of hope. I included photographs of my father with me, showing the love that existed between us despite everything that came after. I realized that the story I had been told about my childhood wasn't entirely false, and it wasn't entirely true. It was a fragment of a much larger, more complex story. The truth was that my family had broken apart, and that had caused real pain. The truth was also that my father loved me, that my mother loved me in her own way, that I was not the cause of their suffering, and that I was worthy of love and belonging exactly as I was. I started speaking openly about this with my own children. I told them that if they ever felt blamed for things that were beyond their control, if they ever felt responsible for adult pain or family dysfunction, that wasn't their burden to carry. I told them that sometimes parents make mistakes. Not always with malicious intent, but sometimes simply because they're struggling and they don't have the tools to process their own pain in healthy ways. I told them that understanding that wasn't about excusing harm, but about refusing to internalize it as a reflection of their worth. My children listened, and I hope they understood. I hope that by being honest about my journey, I'm sparing them from similar journeys. That's what breaking cycles looks like. It's not about pretending the past didn't happen. It's about understanding it clearly enough that you can choose differently. Today, at 52 years old, I am a different person than I was at 7, or 17, or 27. The boy who believed he had destroyed his family, who carried that guilt like a permanent stain on his soul, who spent 40 years trying to atone for a crime he never committed. That boy is finally at peace. Not because everything was resolved perfectly, not because my family suddenly became functional and loving, but because I finally understood the truth that photograph revealed. I was innocent. I was always innocent. I was just a child at a birthday party, wearing a paper crown, eating cake, loved by both parents in that moment, before everything fell apart. The falling apart wasn't my fault. The pain it caused wasn't my responsibility. The narrative that blamed me was a distortion created by adults in pain, not a reflection of reality. That photograph, hidden for 40 years, became the bridge that allowed me to cross from a life lived in exile from myself to a life lived in integration with myself. It proved that somewhere, in some moment captured on film, I had been exactly who I needed to be. I had been innocent. And if I was innocent then, in a moment documented forever, then perhaps I was innocent all along. I don't need my parents' explicit forgiveness anymore. I don't need them to admit they were wrong, though I have found some version of acknowledgement. What I needed was to forgive myself for believing their narrative, to release myself from the prison I had constructed based on their pain. And that forgiveness came not from confrontation or dramatic reconciliation, but from a single photograph and the courage to finally look at it clearly. That's the thing about hidden truths. They don't stay hidden forever. Eventually they surface. Eventually someone finds a photograph in a closet and everything you thought you knew about yourself shifts. Sometimes it takes 40 years. Sometimes it takes a lifetime. But the truth has a way of emerging, and when it does, it gives you a chance to rebuild yourself on a foundation that's actually solid, instead of one made of borrowed guilt and inherited pain. I'm grateful for that photograph. I'm grateful for my sister for showing it to me. I'm grateful for my parents, even with all their flaws and limitations, for loving me as best they could. And I'm grateful for the version of myself that was finally ready to look at the truth without flinching. My childhood didn't destroy my family. My parents' struggles destroyed their marriage, and I survived it. More than survived it. I learned to thrive despite it. That's what I want the world to know. That if you're carrying guilt that isn't yours, if you've been told you're responsible for pain you didn't cause, if you've spent your life believing you're fundamentally flawed because of what happened when you were too young to understand or prevent it, you're wrong about yourself. You were innocent. You always were. And it's never too late to finally see yourself clearly.